Can you imagine a moment in the midst of the deadliest war the world had ever seen, where enemies laid down their guns, not out of surrender, but to share a moment of peace and humanity? It sounds like something out of a movie, but it really happened. Today, we're going back to the winter of 1914, to the muddy, frozen trenches of the Western Front, to tell the incredible true story of the Christmas truce. By December 1914, World War I had been raging for 5 brutal months. The initial belief that the war would be over by Christmas had dissolved into the grim reality of trench warfare. Millions of men were dug in, separated by a desolate, dangerous strip of land called no man's land. Life in the trenches was horrific. It was cold, wet, and filled with the constant threat of death from shells, snipers, or disease. Hope was a scarce commodity. British, French, and Belgian soldiers stared across at German soldiers, trained to see each other as nothing more than the enemy. Yet, as Christmas Eve approached, something extraordinary began to stir along the front lines. It wasn't an order from the high command. In fact, the generals on both sides had forbidden any kind of friendly interaction. This was a movement that came from the soldiers themselves, a spontaneous desire for a moment of peace. It started small. In some sectors, German soldiers began placing small Christmas trees, or Tannenbäume, along the parapets of their trenches, lit with candles. Their glow was a surreal sight against the dark, war-torn landscape. Then, a sound drifted across no man's land, a sound that hadn't been heard for months. It wasn't the roar of artillery, but the sound of singing. German soldiers began singing carols, most famously Still No Hat or Silent Night. Hesitantly at first, the Allied soldiers listened. Then, they responded. British troops began singing their own carols, like the first Noel. For a brief, magical period, the sounds of war were replaced by a concert of Christmas music, sung back and forth between enemies. Imagine the scene, men who had been trying to kill each other just hours before, now sharing the same melodies across the battlefield. This fragile peace, built on song, soon blossomed into something even more remarkable. Brave soldiers on both sides began to cautiously emerge from their trenches. They shouted Christmas greetings across the divide. "Merry Christmas, Tommy," one German might call out, using the nickname for British soldiers. "Merry Christmas, Fritz," a Brit would reply, using the common nickname for Germans. Slowly, tentatively, individuals started to climb out of the relative safety of their trenches and walk into the treacherous no man's land. Hands were raised, not in surrender, but in greeting. They met in the middle, shaking hands, sharing what little they had. They exchanged simple gifts: tobacco, chocolate, buttons from their uniforms, and newspapers. They used broken English, German, and sign language to communicate, showing each other pictures of their families back home. In this moment, they weren't just soldiers. They were young men, far from home, caught in a conflict they didn't fully understand. They saw in each other's faces not a monster, but a reflection of themselves, someone with a family, with hopes, with a life they longed to return to. For a short time, their shared humanity triumphed over the hatred of war. One of the most important, and often heartbreaking tasks during this truce was the joint burial of the fallen. Both sides worked together to retrieve their dead comrades from no man's land, men who had lain there for weeks. They held joint services, reciting psalms and prayers together. It was a solemn, respectful act that underscored the shared tragedy of the war. For these soldiers, it was a chance to grant their friends and their enemies a dignified final rest. And then came the football. In several sectors along the front, the truce famously evolved into impromptu games of football or soccer. Soldiers used whatever they could find as a ball, a bundled-up cap, a tin can, or in some cases, an actual leather football that someone had been sent from home. Accounts from soldiers' letters describe these matches vividly. British and German troops, their uniforms caked in mud, laughing and chasing a ball around the cratered, frozen earth of no man's land. There were no official scores kept, no referees, no grand stadiums. It was just a game. But what a game it was. It was a powerful symbol of normalcy and camaraderie in the most abnormal of settings. For a few hours, they were not enemies on a battlefield. They were simply men playing a game they loved. One British soldier, Ernie Williams, later recalled, "The ball came from somewhere. I don't know where. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. There was no sort of ill will." These truces weren't universal. In many parts of the front, the fighting continued unabated. And tragically, the peace couldn't last. The high commands on both sides were furious when they learned of this fraternization. They issued strict orders to end it, threatening severe punishment. They feared, correctly, that if soldiers saw their enemies as human beings, it would be much harder to get them to fight. As Christmas Day ended and Boxing Day began, the reality of war crept back in. In most places, the truce ended as it began informally. A warning shot might be fired into the air, a signal that the brief peace was over. Slowly, reluctantly, the soldiers returned to their respective trenches. The letters they wrote home are filled with a sense of wonder and sadness. Many expressed a profound disillusionment, with one British soldier writing, "I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I think I've seen one of the most extraordinary sights that anyone has ever seen." The Christmas truce of 1914 was never repeated on such a scale. As the war dragged on, the fighting became even more brutal and industrialized. The introduction of poison gas and the staggering casualties of battles like the Somme and Verdun hardened attitudes on both sides, making such an event unthinkable in later years. The moment of shared humanity was lost to the relentless machinery of war. So why is this story so important to remember, more than a century later? Because the Christmas truce is a powerful testament to the human spirit. It shows that even in the darkest of times, empathy, kindness, and a desire for peace can endure. It reminds us that the lines drawn between people, the uniforms they wear, and the orders they are given cannot completely extinguish their shared humanity. The men who participated in the truce were ordinary people in an extraordinary situation. They chose peace, however temporary, over conflict. Their story is a beacon of hope, a reminder that the bonds that unite us are ultimately stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. It's a story of carols in the dark, handshakes in no man's land, and a game of football on a battlefield. It is, quite simply, the story of an impossible peace. Thank you so much for joining us to look back at this incredible moment in history. If you found this story as moving as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that deserve to be told. Let us know in the comments what you think about the Christmas truce. We'll see you in the next video.